Rosenblum viewers, and welcome to the interview rubric. Today we're at the U.S. Embassy in the occasion of 30th anniversary of diplomatic relation establishment between U.S. and Uzbekistan. So, good morning, Mr. Daniel Rosenblum.
Assalamu alaikum.
So, my first question will be, recently Uzbekistan hosted the first International Investment Forum in Tashkent. Have there been any significant investment portfolios or collaborations involving U.S. Embassy?
So, yes, the International Investment Forum was a big event here a few weeks ago. We had over 70 American companies represented at the forum. I had a chance to meet with almost all of them while they were here. And by all accounts, they thought it was a very useful event, and they were able to explore new opportunities for investments here. Some of them were companies that have been operating for a long time already in Uzbekistan. One example is Honeywell Corporation, which has been here for over 20 years, working in the oil and gas sector, in the chemical sector. Coca-Cola, of course, which has been here for a long time. But there are also companies that are looking to expand and explore their opportunities here, expand their market. One example was there's a medical equipment company called Medtronic, which I think already sells some products here, but is really interested in doing more and maybe entering into some joint ventures. So they were here as well. We also had U.S. representatives from some of our other embassies who support companies exploring this market, for example, from our embassy in Turkey. And they brought with them the American Chamber of Commerce of Turkey, because their member companies want to expand into Central Asia and into Uzbekistan. So the event was I think it was a big success. Of course, the real sign of how much of a success it is whether it leads to more investments and joint ventures, etc. And it's too soon to say on that. But on the whole, I really thought it was a good event. And I'll also mention that it was happening in the context of some major world events, of course, some very important shifts in the region. And it was on everyone's mind, and it was talked about quite a bit.
What is your position on lifting the boycotts of the Uzbek cotton trade?
That's actually, that was another opportunity from recent developments. That you're exactly right. You know, the boycott, which was put in place by a coalition of private organizations and businesses. So this is, just to be clear, this was not a U.S. government or European government or any government initiative, which was in place for a long time, probably 10 or 15 years at least. It was announced that they're ending it a couple weeks ago, and our position was very supportive. We thought it was the right thing to do, and it was based on real progress here in Uzbekistan on the issue that motivated the boycott, which is forced labor in the cotton harvest primarily. And this is something that we've been working in partnership with the government of Uzbekistan and with other international partners for a long time. I personally have been aware and involved in this for probably 6 or 7 years, going back to 2014, 2015, and involved supporting the International Labor Organization, ILO, to do a project to monitor labor every year in the cotton harvest. It involved a lot of training and dialogue, both with the government and with civil society here in Uzbekistan. And it was a success. It worked. Even though we can, congratulate ourselves and each other and be happy about this success, we also have to be a little cautious and careful about how things work going forward. What I mean by that is, I think it is important that there be continued monitoring that goes on, as has been the case. That monitoring may not be done by the ILO anymore, but maybe by local groups. And I know some of the civil society groups are eager to continue doing that. And also, there's still some work to be done in Uzbekistan on issues that have to do with, for example, freedom of association, meaning that workers can form their own organizations to defend their interests. And in that area, and just general monitoring of labor rights and so on, there is still work to be done. and that will continue. I know the U.S. government, other governments are willing to support projects in that area, working with the Ministry of Labor and others, and we very much think it's important to continue that.
So you're working on that currently, right?
Yes.
On these projects.
Yes.
Do you think that will have an impact on the market?
Yeah, so that's actually, we were talking about current events and how they affect, how they tie into this lifting of the boycott. This is another opportunity for Uzbekistan in its textile market. There's a lot of companies who maybe had stayed away before or were very cautious about entering the market here. This boycott ending will send a signal to them that it's time to look at doing business here. Frankly, there's another international factor that affects this too, which is that increasingly many companies are staying away from some regions of China where there are concerns about human rights violations. I'm talking about the Xinjiang region in western China. There's a new U.S. law, in fact, which essentially makes it illegal to import cotton products from Xinjiang. And so companies that have worked there, that have sourced there, are now looking for new markets. Uzbekistan provides a really great opportunity for them.
That's great. What are the main priorities of United States and Uzbekistan's collaboration, and what are the most ambitious projects that have been implemented throughout this 30-year partnership?
First of all, I think that we have worked together successfully with Uzbekistan for over those 30 years because we share some goals, some very important big picture goals. And the two I would identify as being especially important are we both want stability. That is, we don't want violence, we don't want criminal activity and terrorism and so on to disrupt people's lives. And of course, Uzbekistan cares deeply about it for its own citizens, but the United States also, as a foreign policy matter, wants to see stability in this region because instability leads to things that hurt us. I mean, of course, the example everyone remembers is when things got really unstable in Afghanistan in the 1990s, you had the rise of terrorist groups, and then we were attacked on 9/11. So that really convinced us that it's important to focus on this question of stability, and I think the government of Uzbekistan and the people of Uzbekistan also share that. The other issue that has united us over those 30 years and kind of brought us together to collaborate is a shared interest in sovereignty. Of course, Uzbekistan became independent 30 years ago, and it was the U.S. at the time, and ever since, on a repeated basis, has said, we believe that Uzbekistan's independence and its sovereignty are important to preserve and to protect. Through those 30 years, based on shared belief in stability and sovereignty, we've carried out, I would say, 4 lines of effort to build our partnership. One is the political one, where this is our sort of dialogues, our diplomacy, our conversations, where we try to conceive of common goals and common interests. A lot of it has to do with regional policy, for example. A great example is what we call the C5+1, this platform of the 5 Central Asian countries having a dialogue with the United States. Uzbekistan has been a really important supporter of that concept and of the C5+1, a force for regional coordination and integration. And so that's a kind of political principle on which we can unite and work with each other. But there are many others too. A second line of effort is the economic one, which we were just talking about before. So that is, we want to develop trade and investment between the two countries. We want to work together on, for example, some of the economic reforms that are being undertaken here in Uzbekistan to support them. So that's an important line of effort. The third is security, where we do joint military training. We work with your Ministry of Defense, your border guards, your National Guard, and we provide training, we provide equipment, but we also cooperate on, when I say security, it's much broader than just military forces. It's also law enforcement, police working together, trying to catch bad guys who are doing things, across borders, transnational crimes. And so on many levels, we work together in the security realm. And then the fourth basket or line of effort is what I call the human dimension, or humanitarian work together. And that includes everything from exchange programs for students to come study in the U.S., or us sending scholars here to do studies and research, to discussions about human rights and basic principles of human rights and freedoms. And in all four of those areas, I think we've made tremendous progress over the last 30 years. And the progress is towards mutual understanding of each other. Doesn't mean we always agree on everything. We don't. We have differences, and different histories, cultures, etc. will give us different perspectives. But on the whole, we found a lot of good things to do together. And your question, you asked about the most ambitious projects, right, that we have. And I was trying to think, as you asked the question, what would be considered ambitious. And I think actually most of the things we've done together have been small and modest, kind of building on each other. But probably the two most ambitious that come to mind, one was, it actually continues, we've done it almost nonstop since the 1990s, and that is cooperation with respect to Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is Uzbekistan's neighbor. You can't ignore what happens there, and President Mirziyoyev's made clear that he views Afghanistan as part of Central Asia, and it's part of your region very much. And we've also obviously had concerns about stability and security in Afghanistan. So throughout this whole period, throughout these 30 years, there's been a lot of discussion, collaboration, joint efforts to try to bring stability to Afghanistan. Including, during the time when we had troops based there, Uzbekistan was extremely helpful and cooperative in sort of allowing for the transport of things in and out, and for supporting our efforts for diplomacy and other things. So Afghanistan is one example of an ambitious, collaboration that we've had. And I think the other one that is very current and very relevant today is the support that we're providing for President Mirziyoyev's reform program. This, very ambitious set of economic, social, and political reforms.
What is the area U.S. has made the biggest investment in Uzbekistan?
One is health. Definitely with health, that includes, of course, all the assistance we've done in the COVID pandemic, which has been extensive, donating vaccines, helping with infection control and training doctors and nurses, providing testing equipment, etc. Although another big part of our health effort here is on tuberculosis. That's something we've been doing over many, many years to try to control the spread of that, which incidentally, one of the things I learned, I'm not a doctor or a medical expert, but from just being aware of our programs here in Uzbekistan, I've learned that TB, tuberculosis, is the biggest killer in the world for any infectious disease. It far exceeds COVID. Everyone's focused on, of course, what the pandemic has done in the last 2 years, but TB is the real danger. So anyway, health is a big area. A second is education, which I mentioned before. We've invested heavily there, working with the Ministry of Public Education on curriculum reform, teacher training, particularly with respect to English language teacher training, to raise the level of abilities of your English teachers. I think we're going to be training something like 15,000 English teachers here in Uzbekistan. We started this about 2 years ago, and it's continuing. And then the other part of education that we're doing, of course, is the exchange programs that I mentioned earlier, which is giving students an opportunity to study in the United States. There's also economic reform and development as an area. Agriculture is a big part of that. We've worked for many years in agriculture to give farmers access to markets that they can export, and helping them to diversify their crops and move to things that are higher value added. So for example, a farmer who's just maybe growing tomatoes in a greenhouse, how can they move into processing those tomatoes and turning them into ketchup or tomato sauce or something like that? So we've done a lot of big investments in agriculture. And then the fourth area I would identify is rule of law and judicial reform and legal reform. That's another place where we put a lot of effort. Legal education, court reform, like USAID has completely put online all of the civil courts in Uzbekistan are now fully using this electronic system, which makes it more transparent and easier for citizens to have access to. And that was all done through a USAID project. So many examples in all those sectors, but those are the four that I would say are the biggest.
How will you evaluate the 30 year of partnership with Uzbekistan?
I would evaluate it positively, first of all. And as I indicated earlier, I think it's one based on shared interests and to a large extent shared values. I referred to the two big goals, I suppose, of our relationship, which is stability and sovereignty, those two things. And that makes for a strong partnership when you have shared goals, of course. Now, sometimes over those 30 years that we've disagreed on things. Sometimes we've gone a little further apart. We had a stretch of time from around, say, 2005 until maybe 2014 where the relationship cooled a bit and where we didn't have as much activity here, and there were some misunderstandings. But we're in a much better place now. Foreign Minister Kamilov, when he was in Washington in March, and I was back there at that time for meetings with U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Tony Blinken, said, and he said variations on this before, which is he's never seen the relationship at such a high level, such a high point. And this is someone who should know because he's been involved in the bilateral relationship since your independence, basically, since the early 1990s, and has seen it develop. We can talk about any subject openly, even ones we don't always agree on. We can find ways to work together to solve problems, joint problems. I mentioned like some of the transnational threats, and we're finding ways to collaborate to fight terrorism and narcotics trafficking in persons, etc. And ultimately, we know that our friends, our partners, will be predictable and reliable partners. That like we kind of know what each other are going to do. Even sometimes when we disagree, it's in a predictable way. It's you can, and that's a good partnership, and that's what we've built in the past 30 years.
Yeah. Taking into account the visit to Washington of Kamilov, what are the main points that have been discussed on this meeting and are being implemented right now, Clint?
So, because coming when it did in March, obviously the war in Ukraine was discussed. The aftermath of conflict in Afghanistan and how that affects the region was discussed. And we also talked about all the things I mentioned earlier, these lines of effort, economic ones, security ones, humanitarian or human dimension ones, and how we could expand those, sometimes in very concrete ways. We had our strategic partnership dialogue in December here in Tashkent, which again, of course, Foreign Minister Kamilov was involved in, and that's where we really get into the details of things. The minister's visit to Washington, it was at maybe a slightly higher level of discussion, but those were some of the main things we talked about. I should also note that just a week or so after Foreign Minister Kamilov was in Washington, Deputy Prime Minister Umar Zakov was also there on a separate visit, and that one was focused more on economic issues because that's his portfolio. But again, the subject of the war in Ukraine came up in the context of talking about the sanctions and how they might impact the region. So, and what the United States might be able to do to help mitigate that impact. So, anyway, those are some of the main themes.
Kamilov has said the Uzbekistan's position on this situation. How would you evaluate that? And do you think current situation would impact on the relationship between U.S. and Uzbekistan? And if yes, what are the changes that might be in the relationship between the two states?
The foreign minister made a statement, I think that's what you were alluding to, now 2 weeks ago, or maybe a little longer, but in March, about Uzbekistan's position on the war in Ukraine, and it was evaluated positively in Washington and many other capitals, I think. And what I mean by that is that people recognize the Uzbekistan's difficult position, being located where it is and having the relationships that it does, especially economic relationships with big partners, and including and especially Russia, that its position of neutrality, which was stated by the foreign minister, is understandable, and it makes sense to people. They understand why it's taken that position. What we have said to the minister and more broadly, and and I think is also understandable, is that neutrality, it should be a balanced one. That is, and I think the minister was clear. He said we have historical and important relationships with both Ukraine and Russia. We want to maintain those. He also spoke strongly in favor of the principles that I talked about earlier of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity for Ukraine, saying that those were supported and respected by Uzbekistan. And he called for peaceful resolution, for political negotiations and dialogue to bring an end to the violence. So again, I think those were all understood and respected. What we are concerned with, and I think we've made this clear to our partners here, is that again that neutrality be applied in an equal way and be truly balanced and not leaning one way or the other. One example, frankly, that that we would expect to be carried out is to allow for information about all aspects of what's happening in Ukraine to be available and freely shared here in Uzbekistan. It's important for people in the government, but also in society, to know what's happening and to have multiple sources of information. And so we want to ensure that that is in fact the case, because this war, which was an unprovoked attack by one country on another, violating its sovereignty, is so important to the future of the world and to this region. It's important that that not be allowed to happen, that there be some consequence for that kind of action. And because it's so important for the world, and Uzbekistan is very much a part of the world, really needs to have full information from all sides about what's happening, what's really happening on the ground there. So that's something that we've stressed in our dialogues here. But again, going back to the kernel of your question, the hub of it, we understand the position Uzbekistan is in. We respect their sovereign decision. It's part of their sovereignty, of course, going back to that. We respect Uzbekistan's sovereignty so it can decide how it wants to position itself in its foreign policy. It's understandable, and but again, it should be a balanced neutrality. Barchaga, tinchlik, barabonlik, basihat, salamotlik, tilayman.